Hello and welcome to Beaver Off-Road on YouTube. What I'm going to be showing you today is the carrier bearing assembly that's midway in the front drive shaft that goes from the transmission to the front differential. It's kind of a critical part. It's really quite a load-bearing assembly in the machine, especially when you're in four-wheel drive. When you're in two-wheel drive, it's kind of floating along, not really doing a whole lot. But it's pretty simple the way of its makeup. You just have the housing that bolts to the frame and actually will bolt into the machine on top of the frame, sitting just like that. You have two bearing assemblies. You can see the bearings are, when they come stock in the unit, brand new, you can see they have the black rubber seal. I've already had one of these go bad in my machine, and I'll show you a couple more things about it. What you do if you have to replace the bearing in it is you get a bearing with a seal, and bearings will come with seals on each side. You just pop out one of those seals on one side of the bearing. You can see both of them have open bearing on one side, seal on the other. That'll allow the grease to come through and kind of keep the water out. You have two big snap rings that hold the bearing assemblies in. You have your main shaft, which drive shaft here, drive shaft on the other side. Your bearing goes here, and this is your middle area. You also have two roll pins, pins with the slots in the middle. It's basically a hardened steel that is also a spring steel, so that's going to wedge inside these and be driven in. That's what holds your drive shafts on each side of that. Now this is universal. Actually, it can go in a machine either way. It can be turned around either way. This shaft can go either way inside this housing, and it can go either way onto the drive shafts. It doesn't really matter because it's basically the same on both sides. Now, a couple things about the carrier bearing is where it's located in the machine. If you go doing any deep water running, and I can try to show you here, this is what originally happened to my machine when it was brand new, and why I ended up doing the grease zerk mod and replacing the bearing and going with a bearing with a open seal on the side. It's kind of hard to see this, but you can still tell that it's kind of, if you can see that brown rough texture inside there. There's no real rust now, but you can see where it had rusted in the past. And what happened is, when this was in the machine, I just went in deep water, and the way these bearings were sealed on each side and never having any grease in the middle, is I went deep enough, and this was submerged underwater. Water passed through the bearing, and what happened is when the bearing was in there with the seals, once the water passed through the bearing, the water didn't actually ever drain back out of there very well. So what happened is, while it was in there, run along, it ended up rusting up one of the bearings, and also that, and the shaft, and pretty much chewed it up. The biggest way you'll notice when you have a bearing failing on your carrier bearing is when you're in four-wheel drive. When I first had that fail, I was going along in two-wheel drive, and I didn't have any vibration or anything else. But every time I went into four-wheel drive, I had a vibration. And what you're going to do, because the way this mounts to the frame, is you're going to feel it right in your feet, right in the floorboard. And I just kept going, and every time I'd go into four-wheel drive, the vibration got a little worse, a little worse, a little worse. And it wasn't until I started doing some digging to find out that actually water had gotten inside there, rusted one of the bearings. I don't know if I can show you here. One of these bearings is the original, and you can even kind of see there still shows the little signs of the moisture from on the side of the bearing there. The bearing ended up being okay, and it works really smooth. The other bearing failed, so I just had to replace one of the bearings. Now, they're a common bearing. I was able to match it up at the local auto parts store, so that was no real big deal. I don't remember the price off the top of my head, but it seems like it was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $12 to $15 for a bearing. So it's not that big of a deal to fix. One thing you want to do is when you modify your carrier bearing, the best modification is to install a grease zerk by drilling and tapping through your housing so it'll be in the center. And that way, that'll allow this whole center section to fill up with grease. The idea behind that is as you can see, on these bearings, are mounted on the shaft assembly and it's sitting inside here, you have this whole open area. And that's what happened is when this filled up with water, it held the water in between here and it was just rolling in the bearings and rusting up. So what the idea of the grease zerk is that once this is together and everything's held together, you're going to fill this whole void with grease, and it's going to go out and obviously it's going to grease the bearings. It's also going to keep the water up. Or if you do submerge the machine and you do happen to get water in here, you can always grease a little bit, and any of the water you're going to get in here, you're going to pretty much force that water out. Now I've already taken this one apart. There's 2 bolts that hold it right in, that bolts into the machine. To remove the carrier bearing, like I said, you just take out these 2 roll pins. Use the best thing to do is actually a roll pin punch, and you can see this is just a straight punch, but it's of the same or just slightly smaller than that pin size. What that does is that allows, when I'm driving that pin, it lets it pass through at a longer length versus a normal punch that's tapered, so you're only going to drive it so far. So you get a set of roll pin punches, and it allows it to travel right through, and what that does is it keeps a nice flat surface when you're driving that pin out and you're not damaging the pin. The other thing you'll need is a handy dandy little set of snap ring pliers to get that snap ring in and out. So what we're going to do is like I said, when this comes, I'll show you how to assemble it, and this assembly is obviously just the opposite. Now you can see these bearings fit on here tight, but they're not to the point where they have to be driven on. So they slide on there. They're just snug on there, not super tight. So there, you can tell it looks like it may spin every once in a while within the bearing, but it doesn't look like it's causing any real heat problems or any issues like that. The biggest part where you're going to get a tight fit is where this bearing fits into the housing, and this is where it's going to require me to step over here, and I'm going to press this bearing into the housing and the vise, and then I'll come back and set it up for the other side. Okay, through the miracles of editing, you can see I have the bearing mounted inside here now. It's pressed down as far as it'll go. Now what I'm going to do is install the snap ring. The other thing is, when you install the snap ring, these are a spring metal too, and they're a stamped piece of metal before they're turned into spring. So what you'll see is one edge is going to have, one side's going to have a little bit of an edge, the other side's going to be a little rounded where it's been stamped down. What you want to do when you install these is use the sharper edge and put this against, this will be the load bearing side. So in this case, the bearing is going to be, the load bearing will be the bearing that's going to want to push out of the unit. So we'll put that sharper edge, and that'll click on the inside. That sharp edge will be facing out. And what we do is just take a screwdriver, make sure the snap ring's snapped down in there all the way. Make sure it's seated fully in the groove. Okay, now that we have this installed, and we'll get these little things out of the way and wipe up my mess here. Now you just simply install the shaft back in there and install this bearing in there, and we'll go over here and set this bearing. Okay, now you can see I've got this bearing seated in the side, so I'll check my snap ring to find that sharper edge. And this is my sharper edge, this is my round edge, so I want my sharp edge out to be in the load bearing side. Make sure it's seated in there properly. Looks good. And that's pretty much all there is to your carrier bearing. The biggest thing that you need to do, and you could do this upgrade without tearing it down, is installing this grease zerk or grease fitting, so you're going to be able to grease within that housing and grease through. Now when you're greasing it, you don't want to pour tons of grease outside, because you can end up just damaging these seals anyhow. So you just, once you grease it, you can kind of tell as you're greasing it when you start to pack that open. It's easier to do it initially. Like what I'll do is I'll grease it right now, and then I can spin the housing, spin the shaft, and then I know I'm pulling that grease all the way around and get it fully packed. You want to make sure that it's nice and smooth in its rotation, and it does have a little bit of a load on it. Because the bearings are already full of grease already. I did find a little bit of grit inside here. I'm not feeling anything inside the bearing, so that grease does do a good job of keeping the dust and dirt out of here too. But basically we're gonna want to grease that, get just a small little trickle of grease coming out of there, and then after that, every time we grease that, I don't know, I usually give it maybe 5-8 shots of grease, and that's usually all it takes to keep this unit greased. But if you're going to be doing any kind of water running, you want to make sure you do this update on yours. You can, like I was going to say, is you can do it without disassembling the housing, but you got to remember that when you're drilling through that, obviously when you're drilling through, you're going to be putting metal shavings onto the inside. So if you drill that right, it's not a very big bit that you drill that with. If you drill it carefully, I would recommend putting grease on your drill bit, and that'll catch some of the shavings. That'll keep shavings outside of your housing from going inside there. But it's pretty simple operation. But this really is a critical part for the machine, because like I said, when this is in 4-wheel drive, you have the loads on your drive shaft and your loads on your drive shaft, and you have those two universal joints where this connects, and those shafts are wanting to twist, and you're putting a large bind on that. That's really putting a large load, and it's kind of a binding load on this carrier bearing, and that's why it's so critical in its operation. But you can see it's pretty simple to do. Now all I have to do is add a little grease to it, bolt it back into the machine, slide the drive shafts on, and I'm all set. But I wanted to give you a little idea of when we mentioned the carrier bearing or a possible vibration issue with the machine, and mention this and talk about having a grease zerk installed. This is what we're talking about. Like I said, simple operation, but it's a critical part. But I hope you get a little better understanding of what your carrier bearing looks like on your Reeper, and how it works, and how you can take it apart, and what you need to do to update it. And I appreciate you watching my video on YouTube. Have a good day.